It's my role today to welcome you all. And I must say, it's absolutely wonderful to see so many of us Bedfordians back here in our home. Quite clearly, I'm not Margaret Hodge, or Dame Margaret, as I should say. She was hoping to be here today, and I know that because I spoke to her a few weeks ago down at Egham. But she's not able to join us and sends her sincere apologies. So I hope I can be a reasonably good stand-in for her. This is the second in our series of events to mark the 175th anniversary of Bedford College. And some of you, I think, were able to attend the event in Maggs Brothers in April. And that's where we looked at the beginnings of the college, the founding in 1849 and the first home. And following the foundation in Bedford Square, college had two further homes, one near Baker Street and then one on the edge of the park here. And finally came to rest here in 1913. So however many years ago, is that 71, 72, quite a lot more than that, 100 and... you could work it out for yourself. I'm a medieval historian, not a mathematician. We were on this site for a very long time, so it really is very good to be back. And we'll be talking today about how the first principles, the founding principles of the college, were a thread running through the 175 years. And I'm delighted to hand on to Professor Caroline Barron, who I think will be known to many of us here, founder member of the Bedford Society Committee and long-term member of staff of Bedford College, who's going to introduce the speakers and chair the session.
Thank you, Claire, very much for that introduction. If we can't have Dame Margaret Hodge, you're a very good substitute. Thank you. So I'm just going to chair the session this afternoon. I just did reflect. I want to just share something with you. I joined the Bedford History Department in 1964 as a tutorial research student, and then I morphed into taking the place of somebody who was on sabbatical. And then when she didn't return, I got her job. And I have to confess, I didn't have an interview and I hadn't finished my doctorate. And I got a job. So those were the days. Now, 1964, that means, I worked this out, that I have been associated with Bedford College for a third of its existence. For a whole third of the time that Bedford College I've been there. So I feel a deep loyalty to the college and to the college that it has become, Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. But today, we're going to look at some of the ways in which Bedford students and the Bedford archives have illuminated aspects of the wider society in ways that were very significant and important, and perhaps things that we didn't actually know about, although we were at Bedford. So I'm going to start first. We have Dr. Katie McGettigan. How do you say McGettigan? McGettigan, who is a senior lecturer in the English department here at Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. And she works on American literature in the 19th century, but that, rather surprisingly perhaps, led her into the archives, the Bedford archives, which are now housed, of course, at Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. So she's going to tell us a bit about that connection. So Katie, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you everyone for the invitation to come and talk to you today about some research that I've done about Elizabeth Jesser Reid and the early days of Bedford College through, as Caroline said, some of the papers that are now held in the archives at Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. So. Oh, there we go. Excellent. So I want to start then with a letter from around 1860, written by the Anglo-Irish writer, philosopher, and indefatigable campaigner for social reform of all kinds, Frances Power Cobbe, who wrote to her friend Elizabeth Jesser Reid, committed feminist, educationalist, and founder of Bedford College in 1849, and she was writing to ask a favour. Cobbe and another friend were looking for a journal in which to publish some lectures on the failings of the Bristol workhouse system, but they lacked the connections necessary. Cobbe hoped for assistance in this matter from Reid, who shared her reforming energy, interest in contemporary and sometimes quite radical philosophy, and had always shown strong interest in what Cobbe called our workhouse struggles, and whom Cobbe thought might be well placed for this task. So she writes, back again, sorry. I do not know any editors at all, but as all nice people seem to know Mrs. Reid, I feel a conviction that you must have access to all manner of persons. I think Cobbe's exclamation marks show a kind of teasing here between two friends, but I think she's also pointing out something that was very true. Reid was extraordinarily well connected among not only writers and editors, but politicians, activists, artists, thinkers, and all of this is evidenced in the papers that are held in the Bedford College archives. And I like to think about this as a kind of sociability. I put networking on there, but I don't love the word networking because I think it sounds like Reid was very kind of instrumentalizing and tactical and strategic and doing this all for her own benefit. And I don't think she was really. I think she was just a woman who was very interested in the world and very interested in other people and their thoughts and their ideas and their thoughts about how the world could be made a better place. And the thing that I'd like to really talk about today is how that sociability, that energy to make connections, that interest in others becomes a really important part of the Bedford Project, and indeed what we might think of as a kind of radical political work in its own right. So if I could go to the next slide. So just to start by talking a little bit about the papers and about my own encounters with them, because you might all be wondering why a lecturer in American literature ended up digging around in this archive of a Victorian educationalist. It's quite an unusual archive in that there's only actually one letter written by Elizabeth Jesser Reid in the whole papers. What we have instead is a set of incoming correspondence to her, which means reading through the archive is this really interesting process of piecing together Elizabeth Jesser Reid via the impressions and the words of others. She's a kind of absence at the centre of all this, which I think is in many ways, quite sadly, symbolic of her kind of place in history more widely. She's not as well known as she should be, even though she was really such a central connection in all of these kind of impulses, these reforming impulses in Victorian culture. So the archive has about 300 or so letters in it, and I would say roughly 75% of them are from these four correspondents, three of whom were very influential and notable figures in their own right. So to just go over them briefly, Anna Brummell Jameson was a writer, a literary critic. She wrote one of the most influential 19th century studies of Shakespeare plays. Henry Crabb Robinson is now kind of more famous, I guess, because he wrote a diary about all his meetings and kind of encounters with lots of other famous writers, particularly the Romantic late poets, so people like Coleridge and Wordsworth. And he also is one of the people who was involved in the founding of UCL, which becomes very important for his friendship with Elizabeth Jesser Reid, because he's a kind of I guess he's sort of a wise advisor, and when she writes about, or she seems to have written to him about things going badly with the college, he says, you know, it was like that in UCL, and if you stick with it, I know you'll get through it. Mary Clark Mole is an amazing character. She really was a character. She was a British woman who marries a German philologist and runs a kind of literary and academic salon in Paris. So she writes all these exciting letters about the kind of politics and culture of Paris. And then there is Eliza Bostock, who is the one who's most involved in the Bedford Project. She was a house manager, a benefactor, and one of the people who Elizabeth Jesser Reid leaves in charge of the college at her death. And she's probably Elizabeth Jesser Reid's closest friend, although there's a generational gap. So there's also a kind of mother-daughter relationship between them. And then there is a set of miscellaneous correspondence who I will come back to in a moment. So just to move to the next slide. So I really came across these letters because I saw one in a college exhibition, which was done in 2018, about the anniversary of the women's suffrage, the 100th anniversary. And I was really interested because I could see that they were talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe, the 19th century American author of the best-selling and very influential anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I was writing a book at the time about the publication of American literature in Britain. And I thought, oh, that's cool. There's probably some other interesting stuff in there. Maybe I'll go and have a look. And then I started looking and I found there was lots of interesting things in there, both for me and I thought for other people. And I really wanted this letter collection to be better known. I wanted more people to be able to find out about it. So with the college archivist, who was then Annabelle Valentine, but is now Anne-Marie Purcell, they've both helped me put together a project where we scanned all the letters, we uploaded them, and we're beginning to transcribe them. And our aim is to both make the letters better known so that more scholars can access them without having to go to Royal Holloway. But also, once we've got a set of transcripts, we can do different forms of analysis on them. We might be able to see which names get repeated lots. We might be able to see if there's places that are mentioned. So we can think about what the collection shows at a scale and not just individual letters. And if you're interested, I'm happy to circulate the web address and you can go and read some of these for yourself. So if we move on. So thinking about the letters themselves, the thing that really amazed me about this collection was quite how many people of note of the 19th century are in some ways involved in it. So I will say this is in no way all the names that turn up in the collection. These are just some ones that I found interesting. The ones on the kind of top level, which is kind of pinky red, they're the people who actually write letters. So they're all in the miscellaneous correspondence. The second layer, which is blue, they're just people who get mentioned as kind of people they were bumping into, talking to. And I haven't even managed to go into all the people whose books they're reading, whose lectures they're attending. It's this absolute milieu of connections across so many different fields. I think that was one of the other things that struck me. My key kind of color coding them is really quite crude. Lots of these people were working across lots of different fields, but it does show you that Elizabeth Jesser Reid was connected incredibly widely in terms of her interests. The other thing that I'd note is the internationalism of her collection. I was particularly keen to see that there are so many Americans who get mentioned. So not only Harriet Beecher Stowe, but also Ralph Waldo Emerson, Catherine Moriah Sedgwick, who was another very popular female writer of the time. But we also have Italian reformers, so Joseph Mazzini, and they also talk in the letters about their absolute enthusiasm for Garibaldi, like many other British Victorians. They were very keen on Garibaldi. And also a man called Ramahan Roy, who was an early kind of Bengali nationalist as well, and also a women's rights campaigner, which I think is why Elizabeth Jesser Reid and him were connected with each other. So she meets all these people from all around the world, partly meeting them in Europe, actually. So she bumps into them in Italy or when she's on tours of Germany. If we move to the next slide. So what this really tells us, I think, about Bedford College is that it wasn't only at the centre of debates about the place of women and the education of women. It was also at the centre of some of the most important questions more widely that were being taken up by the kind of best minds, I guess, of the 19th century. So just to think about one of these, perhaps, we could think about religious liberty. So Elizabeth Jesser Reid was a Unitarian. Many of her correspondents are also from dissenting Protestant backgrounds. And this intersects with educational reform because the 19th century is a moment, as I'm sure many of you know, in which non-Anglicans are barred from the two big universities, and so they have to find other places in which to educate themselves. So this idea about, all these debates about religion that are happening in the 19th century are very much also embedded in education. If we move to the next slide. But the debate that I was really the most interested in as an American literature specialist was anti-slavery. So as I'm sure people here know, Great Britain finally abolishes slavery in the Empire in 1837, but anti-slavery activism in Britain doesn't disappear. In fact, it sort of becomes a kind of more widespread and culturally normative value that becomes very much associated with British identity across the 19th century. And there is also at the same time a core of very devoted abolitionist activists who turned their attention to the United States, where slavery remained legal in the South until the Northern victory in the Civil War in the mid 1860s. And this is really important because Britain becomes a space where particularly Black Americans can come over, can find a degree of freedom that they don't have in the United States. They give lectures, they raise support for their cause. And it's also important because anti-slavery becomes another staging ground for activism over women's rights. Women were particularly influential in the anti-slavery movement, but they were often relegated to positions of organizing. So they ran events, they raised money. And there were big controversies at an 1840 anti-slavery convention about whether women had the right to speak. Elizabeth Jesser Reid is very well connected to these abolitionist activists in Britain and the United States. And Bedford itself, as I'm sure many of you know, is actually able to further the cause of American abolitionism when it admitted Sarah Parker Remond as a student in 1859. So Remond was a free Black woman from the United States, but one who lectured on anti-slavery, and she studied at Bedford, and then after her time there actually went to Europe, where she qualified as the first Black doctor. The college records suggest that her time at Bedford was perhaps not the smoothest, and I don't want to suggest that Bedford was this kind of utopia of absolute racial equality, because there are also letters in the archive from former students that suggest some of them still held kind of regressive and quite reprehensible views. But her admission did make a statement, I think, about the priorities and politics of Bedford and its progressivism in both causes of women's liberty, but also racial equality. And at the same time, Bedford was equally a training ground for a new generation of anti-slavery activists, because some of the most important anti-slavery families in Britain were sending their daughters there for education. If we go to the next slide, though, we can see that the relationship between Bedford's educational mission and Elizabeth Jesser Reid's anti-slavery views was not always smooth. So this is from the letter that really first got me interested in this collection. And this is from Eliza Bostock, so Elizabeth Jesser Reid's really close friend, writing in what seems to be in response to a suggestion by Elizabeth Jesser Reid that Harriet Beecher Stowe would come and give a lecture at the college. So this letter is from 1856, and Stowe was at this time in Britain for the publication of her second novel, which is also an anti-slavery novel. It's called Dread. She was at the absolute height of her fame at this point. And this is also the very same moment as the Republicans, who were then the party of anti-slavery, would very narrowly lose the 1856 presidential election. It's a time where what is going to be the future of the United States is a really charged electric cause. And so Bostock writes in response to Reid, "I should be very glad to have lectures on anything else to help the abolitionist cause, but what has it to do with education? And therefore, why should the lecture be given at college? The college is on the brink of ruin. The whole question of having female colleges at all is in a most precarious state. Why add to the risk by introducing an unexpected novelty? The only chance of the colleges answering and doing some good they might do for the great women's cause is to keep them quietly at work in their own proper sphere, and not challenging notice and thereby opposition by doing anything good, bad, or indifferent out of the usual routine." Bostock's really anxious, I think, about raising this problem with her close friend. She knows how close this cause is to Elizabeth Jesser Reid's heart. And from a 21st century perspective, I understand Bostock's reluctance, right? This is a college that she's committed her life to. She doesn't marry because she has to remain single to fulfill Reid's wishes in the Reid Trust. It overwhelms her. You know, she's someone who's carrying out, she's not only intellectually committed, she's the person who's like ordering bookshelves and working out what goes wrong when there's a weird smell in the room, and all of this stuff is in the college archives. And I think one of the really interesting things is how much this kind of day-to-day labor, which is often undervalued, feminized labor, is hand in hand with these big intellectual questions. So I understand that sense of anxiety that she has, and I can at the same time feel that and also be kind of maddened by the fact that she's quite unthinkingly excluding Black enslaved women from what she calls the great women's cause. And there is a sense, I think, here that Black women just have to wait their turn, right? That this will come. Once we get this established, then we can go on to the next thing. And I find this letter really important because I think it helps us remember that we can be kind of inspired and energized by these women, but also remain clear-eyed about their blind spots and their assumptions. So my last slide is just some kind of things to summarize about the kind of legacies and I think the futures of this collection. I think it really reminds us that Bedford is a university that was not an ivory tower, but one that is engaged with the pressing concerns of its day, even if that sometimes meant making very difficult choices between competing priorities. It's an institution that had international perspectives and networks, and one which combined, I think, intellectual and practical commitments to reform causes at all scale. So the letters show things from kind of helping individuals access education to these kind of wider debates, trying to change policy, trying to change the direction of governments. These letters that are full of energy and work, again, at all scales, including thinking about the real political work of forms of labour that are often devalued, things like administration, cleaning up afterwards, ordering the tea and coffee, as I like to think about it, that often fall on women even today. And so I think it's important to think about these things as part of reform work. And I think that all of these things, the energy, the enthusiasm, the outward facingness, the desire to affect meaningful change, are also qualities that I see today in my students at Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. And I think that's something that we're really trying to continue with the legacy of the work at the university today. I'd also say that we've only scratched the surface really of this really fascinating collection, and it would be really great if we could continue the work on this. And so I'm really hoping that it's something that the college archives can do more with in the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
That was a really interesting talk, Katie, and reminds us, that there was more to Elizabeth Jesser Reid than simply the founding of Bedford College, important as that was. I think just to say one thing, which Claire and I worked on the archives for the MAGS event, I think it's important to remember how parlous the founding of Bedford College was. It very, very nearly failed, and but for Elizabeth Jesser Reid injecting more money and her determination, it would not have succeeded. She was a remarkable woman, not perhaps a very good-looking woman, at least according to her photograph, but a remarkable woman. And I think the range of her contacts that you've suggested is really important. So we're now going to move forward in time a little bit when Professor Felix Driver, who is the Professor of Human Geography at Royal Holloway and Bedford New College, but I've always thought geography was an exciting subject. It seems you can do anything and call it geography. And he seems to be studying a whole lot of aspects. He's very much a public-facing geographer. He's a fellow of the British Academy. And he's looked at Bedford women who've moved out, as it were, from England and made their mark in other parts of the world. And so this is what Felix is going to talk to us about today. Felix, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to talk. I'm going to tell some stories about 4 women students whose connections with Bedford College lasted a lifetime. So these are alumni stories. These are stories about alumni a generation or 2 ago. They come from work I've been doing on the history of the college and especially its geography department, which was founded a century ago in 1920. So we just had its centenary. The first slide that you can see, I hope, shows some of the larger themes coming out of this research about universities and social mobility, about international lives and friendships, and about the uses of archival stories, some of which we've heard, and there are many more that I'll be talking about, and about students as agents of social change. Starting with alumni and students is not the usual way of writing histories of universities and departments. And here I take inspiration from David Hilling, who some of you will remember, did something of lasting value for the Bedford 150th anniversary in 1999. He asked alumni, a generation of alumni, about their memories of the geography department, especially staff and field trips. And the result was an amazing cache of 67 letters documenting memories of their student selves from the 1920s to the 1960s. And all of these are now in our archives. Fantastic resource. Next slide. In books on the history of universities, we often find chronicles of eminent principals and professors, people like the first professor of geography, the genial meteorologist Gordon Manley, caricatured here on your left by a Bedford colleague with showing Gordon Manley with his head in the clouds suitably. Now, Manley's inaugural lecture in 1949, wittily titled Degrees of Freedom, was in fact the geography department's inaugural. The first professor. The department had been going nearly 30 years, but it hadn't had a professor. It was undoubtedly an important event. But rather than concentrating on the speaker, why don't we think about his audience? 300 or 400 people, most of them students. And here, the archives can help us. We find in the archives a list of VIP guests. We find the names of those invited for tea. And best of all, we find a sign-up sheet for students, hundreds of whom attended the lecture. So next slide. Let's look then at the lives of our 4 Bedford College alumni who were or could have been in the audience that day. The first of them, a woman called Madeline Roof, was the daughter of an East London builder, educated in a convent school with the support of a local grant. Here is a classic story of social mobility. Having started at Bedford College in 1919, she interrupted her studies following 2 protracted periods of serious illness, and she undertook voluntary work, and eventually she returned to graduate as late as 1932, 13 years later, not in geography, but in sociology. She later worked as a tutor at Bedford. She published 2 books on social welfare and social work and family welfare, the last of which was published in 1972. So in fact, some of you may remember her. Her largely unsung career speaks to larger issues about the relationship between social purpose and sociology in 20th century Britain, and especially women's role within these fields. But unfortunately, it's not that I'm going to be talking about, because I'm going to talk instead, next slide, about her wonderful photo album of student life that survives in the archives. This little album was donated to our archives in the 1990s. It's a fantastic object. It tells us not just about Madeline's circle of friends, but about now what we now call the student experience. Here we see members of the union committee. We see her friends, the tennis champions. We see the residents, or some of them, in her hostel. And on the far right, we see somebody who is captioned the librarian. And this woman was called Jessie Patterson, and she was a warden of a student hostel. Next slide. Jessie Patterson was librarian at Bedford for 30 years, a period which saw the building and extension of the Tate Library around the corner here. Tragically, after all this work, her life was cut short in 1941 when she was killed in a bombing raid on London. But a plaque was put up to her memory in the library, which you can see here today. A memorial service was arranged in Cambridge, where Bedford College had decamped during the war. And Madeline Roof, my first life story, was amongst the large number of students in attendance at King's College Chapel. So next slide. Madeline Roof's album is a fabulous document, not just for its portraits. You can see the next slide, but also for the photos of classrooms and laboratories, which are in fact the earliest we have of these spaces. 2 of the photos you can see here depict learning in action on the left and the right there. These are students plane tabling in Regent's Park with the library behind. And I want to use that as a moment of digression into archives of fieldwork and what we can do with them. Next slide, please. Because as you can see from the top left, that's the photo that Madeline Roof in her album. But you can see that plane tabling was part and parcel of the geography student experience right into the 1990s, in fact. The hairstyles and the cigarettes, if you can make them out, come and go. But there's also a tangible sense of continuity in the learning experience and some fun in the process. And our archives contain quite a few photographs of students doing and enjoying fieldwork. Next slide. Some of these photographs are rather like team photos. These very jolly students, at least the ones on the left, are enjoying adventurous fieldwork a century ago. If you look at the snap on the right, you may be able to see a woman of colour right at the centre of the group. Next slide, or a little annotation. Her name was Fatma Fathi. She was born in Cairo, where she attended the first training college for women before attending Bedford College. She was one of a growing number of international students at Bedford in the interwar period. Next slide, please. Fieldwork and travel was one of the specialities of my second Bedford life. Dora Smee, who studied for a BA, MA, and PhD in geography at Bedford and became a lecturer in 1930. She taught at Bedford for 35 years. She's still remembered, in fact, by some of you, I know, and remembered in the naming of the Smee and Timberlake Student Prize for contribution to the life of the geography department where she taught. And like many women university teachers in this period, she's remembered affectionately for her commitment to student welfare. Next slide. Alumni and academics alike recall Dora Smee as a charismatic, chain-spoken, and decidedly opinionated woman. One student provided this photograph of a field trip in 1957, and if you can just about make it out, she's managing the feat of knowing how to deal with an ice cream in one hand and a cigarette at the same time. Finding out more about the life of someone like Dora Smee is a challenge. She tends to be spoken of by academics, particularly somewhat condescendingly, as somewhere between eccentric and irrelevant. But if we start with the alumni remembrance of her and also her student record, we find something interesting. In the records, we find evidence of a humble background. We find her choosing to do teacher training as a way of enabling her social mobility. While she was still a student, in fact, she was employed as a companion to the daughter of a fabulously wealthy American woman named Constance Ismay, who owned a large Northamptonshire estate at Hazel Beach. Next slide. Following the death of her husband in 1924, Constance Ismay travelled the world with Dora Smee as her companion, guide, and photographer. After Dora Smee's appointment at Bedford College, Dora divided her year between Hazel Beach and her Baker Street flat. On one of her long-distance trips, she took Constance to see her family in New Zealand. They'd emigrated there during the First World War, having got special leave from the principal. There's no doubt that this relationship with Constance was the most important relationship of Dora Smee's life, and yet there's nothing about this other life in the few published accounts of her career as an academic geographer. Next slide. Dora's travels gave her ample material for her lectures, as well as photographs for Constance's many photo albums. Sometimes the travels were truly glamorous, as I believe some of you may know. For example, a chauffeur-driven trip to Timbuktu was cut short when the car was stranded in the sands of the Sahara. One of the photos in this album, on the right-hand side, shows Dora eating a plum pudding baked by her students at Bedford College. Next slide. It's through the student reminiscences that we can glimpse where Dora Smee's personal and professional lives intersected, in fact. Several of the alumni who wrote to David Hilling in 1999 remembered travelling to Hazel Beach to undertake fieldwork in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, she started this in the 1930s. They mapped landscape, they mapped land use, and they mapped soil types on the estate. One of them, in fact, recalls being fetched from the station by the chauffeur in a Rolls Royce. In 1974, long after her retirement, when Dora finally published the fruits of a massive local soil survey involving the drilling of 70,000 boreholes on the estate, she highlighted in the caption, and I apologize for the bad quality of this slide, she highlighted in a key the names of every single student, there's about 100 names there, who had contributed to the work. And she gave some a star, I think some of you, one or two of you present, for countless visits. And I think that tells you something about her relationship with her students. Next slide, please. Turning thirdly to my third case study, Shanti Rangarao. In 1938, Dora Smee and Constance dropped into Nagpur in the Indian state of Maharashtra to visit a former student in 1938. By this time, Shanti Rangarao, who had graduated first class in geography and economics from Bedford in 1933, was principal of a women's college at Nagpur. And as you may be able to see here, both Dora and Constance appear in these photographs in saris. Next slide. Shanti's career is part of a larger history of women's education and indeed women's rights in India, in which both British liberals and Indian nationalists participated. These women included, on the one hand, Eleanor Rathbone, who spoke at a fundraising meeting here in Bedford College in support of Nagpur College in 1936. They also included Shanti's sister, Radhabai Subbarayan, who was a representative of Indian women at the Roundtable conferences in London on the future of India in the early 1930s. The terms, and I won't read them out, but if you can read them, the terms in which Eleanor Rathbone spoke about Indian women's education may seem patronizing to us today, but they reflect the ways in which feminist and colonial causes were deeply entangled at this moment. So here's a life history which intersects with a really interesting combination of the history of women's rights and the history of late colonialism. Next slide. Shanti Rangarao, oh, that's the big quote I was referring to. I think we're going backwards at this point. Next one, please. Great. Shanti Rangarao remained loyal to Bedford College throughout her life. She kept successive principals up to date with professional and personal developments, whether in fact they wanted to know them or not, I suspect, including the design of a new college building funded by the industrialist Tata family. She later visited Bedford on several occasions. So I'm talking now about after the Second World War, after independence. In 1951, she registered for PhD study in sociology again, taking as her topic caste and democracy in India. She went on to give public lectures in Britain and the United States on various subjects, including the position of women in India, progressive education, India's role in world peace, discrimination and prejudice in higher education, about which she knew a little, and Indian art through the ages. While her registration as a PhD student was renewed annually for many years, it seems that the PhD was never submitted and the degree eluded her in the end. We don't know the reasons for this. Next slide. But we do know that it didn't reflect any lack of enthusiasm for authorship. In 1957, she published a cookbook on good food from India, which has been reprinted many times. I'm delighted to say it is within the Royal Holloway Library. Next slide. The last of my 4 case studies, my 4 alumni stories, is the best known, at least in academic circles, and probably to more of you than the others. Monica Cole studied geography at Bedford College, completed a PhD soon after the war. One student remembers her as, quote, a bit difficult as a student, unquote, though, quote, she did very well in the geography world, unquote. She did indeed. After holding posts in South Africa and at Kiel, she returned to Bedford College as professor and head of department in 1964. She was the first woman to hold a physical geography chair anywhere in the UK. She was a genuine pioneer. Next slide. The story of Monica's academic career is also the story of the internationalization of environmental science research. From the 1950s to the 80s, her interest in biogeography, geobotany, and remote sensing took her to many parts of the world for fieldwork and conferences, notably Australia and South Africa, where she retained close contacts throughout her life. Next slide, please. As head of department at Bedford, featured here the Geographical magazine and a new look for that magazine in 1968, suitably enough. Monica was strongly committed to a vision of geography involving high-tech laboratory analysis as well as global fieldwork. And in this period, she used research grants and sponsorship from mining companies, including Rio Tinto Zinc, amongst others, to fund purchase of the latest laboratory equipment. Next slide. On appointment as chair, Monica secured laboratory space in an extraordinary building around the corner, which some of you may know, leased by the college in nearby Peto Place. This was a former clinic, previously a Baptist chapel, and before that, a famous place of entertainment in Georgian London. The space was shared, not very happily, I'm afraid, with the sociologists. Next slide. Next slide, please. One laboratory assistant thought it was haunted, in fact. Eventually, the lease ran out and the building was given up. It was later used as a squat, an arts collective, and a venue for happenings. Apparently, the Manic Street Preachers played there in 1991. In the eyes of her colleagues, Monica Cole was a difficult person to deal with. Relations with her staff soured, leading to long-running disputes, which eventually culminated in the appointment of a second professor who replaced her as head of department in 1975. Next slide. Students have mixed memories of Monica. The more politically conscious questioned her attitudes towards the apartheid regime in South Africa and her reliance on industrial sponsorship from mining companies. Student-led campaigns on these very subjects at national level, especially in the University of London, were hitting the headlines at this time, late 60s, early 70s. Bedford College students played their part, as a few of you may remember, and these issues were aired in the pages of the University Student magazine, Senate, as well as Bedford College's own Inner Circular magazine during the 1970s. So in conclusion then, in 15 minutes or so, I have introduced 4 life stories, and I hope I've touched on many more worlds. Next slide. Through the prism of these life stories, we can see beyond the particular cases to wider themes which continue to matter. Themes like social mobility, friendship, community, diversity, internationalism. I think it's important to approach these themes through the eyes of students and alumni, as well as those of academics. And that is why I began with those alumni letters, and why I often find myself contemplating the kind of cohort photo like this that you can still find in some academic departments. This is one class of 1968, and I've redacted the names here, you'll be pleased to know, to save some of you embarrassment or simply shock at the recognition of yourselves. I hope I've said enough to convince you that the archives of Bedford College are a precious resource for thinking about our university's social purpose in the 21st century. Finally, I'm going to leave you with a picture that might suit the soundtrack of my lecture, with some other snapshots from these wonderful archives, just to show that having a social purpose is not altogether inconsistent with having fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felix. The soundtrack is, you organised that specially, did you? Yes. But two things I think about that. One, at least 2 of the people you mentioned came from very modest backgrounds. And that's one of the things I think we want to think about Bedford. It was a way in which people from quite modest backgrounds were able to be educated and to have interesting and lively careers. So that's something to bear in mind. And then also that last photograph of the class of 1968. Now, I think I'm right that in 1965, it was that Bedford agreed to admit men as undergraduates. And I was looking at that photograph. I think there were 25 people in that photograph of the class of 1968. 5 of them were men, but still predominantly a female college in the late 1960s. So that was a very important and significant development. And we're lucky to have Jenny Brock, who was at Bedford at that time, who lived through that transformation, who then went on in the sociology department. She worked with Professor McGregor. She did research herself and has gone on doing research into political sociology, the politics and science of politics. And we're very lucky to have her to tell us about the experience of the 1960s. So, Jenny, thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. Okay, so no slides this time, just me, I'm afraid. And let me start by saying that my contribution to this afternoon's proceedings focused on the admission of male students in the mid-60s is one that is based very much, let's say entirely almost, on my personal experiences as first a student and subsequently a member of staff during the 60s and the 70s. And so perhaps I should first issue a couple of caveats. It may well be that with the passage of time, and it's obviously been a very long time since the mid-1960s, especially at my age, some of those recollections, some of those memories are a bit shaky. I have, where possible, fact-checked them using written sources, and I've also accessed the hopefully more robust memories of 1 or 2 of my contemporaries. But maybe an even more important reservation, I was, as you've been told, throughout the whole of that time in the sociology department. Sociology was obviously the biggest department, but nevertheless it was outnumbered by the totality of all the other departments, and the experiences of other people in the college at the time may have been rather different to mine, may have been totally different indeed, but certainly somewhat. So pay attention. We shall expect at some stage that you will give us some feedback on your own memories to enhance the archives of the Bedford Society. So, male undergraduates were first admitted to the college in October 1965, a development described indeed as momentous. But let me say up front, I'm not at all sure that it did feel that momentous a change at the time, or that such changes that took place at the college then and in the following years could be directly attributed to the admission of male undergraduates. The 1964 intake, my intake, was the last all-female year. So I witnessed the transition to a fully coeducational establishment from a front row seat. Except, of course, even in 1964, Bedford wasn't by any means an entirely single-sex establishment. To those of us who'd attended girls' grammar schools, and there were a lot of us who'd attended girls' grammar schools then, it already felt relatively co-ed. The only man at my school was the caretaker. But at Bedford, there were already male postgraduates, first admitted to the college since 1946. And by the time I was there were some 150 male postgraduates. From the outset, there'd always been a significant number of male teaching staff, and there were male staff in administration and working in the library. In addition, some of the departments had intercollegiate links because they were teaching university degrees. As a sociology student, I routinely went over to LSE for some of my lectures. And there, of course, we did come into contact with a lot of men. That was, in fact, how I met my own husband. Other departments also, I believe, had long had similar shared teaching arrangements with other colleges. Nevertheless, male undergraduates at Bedford were definitely a new thing. And in 1965, a grand total of 47 entered these portals. But over the next few years, their numbers did increase pretty rapidly, both absolute and relative to the size of the total student body. By 1969-70, only 4 years after male undergraduates were first admitted, they constituted a third of the student body. Over those 4 years, there'd also been a 20% increase in the total number of students. This was an agreed of undergraduates. This was an agreed strategy to meet the concerns of those who'd quite vehemently opposed the admission of men, because they were concerned that it would reduce the number of places available to women. So, given this undoubtedly significant change in the student demographic, both the sex ratio and the total numbers, what impact did it have? What around then changed? What stayed the same? And also, did the male students have an impact above and beyond their actual numbers? First, one pretty clear constant. It almost goes without saying that throughout the whole of the time that the college was based in Regent's Park, including both before and after the admission of men, many of us, all of us, I think, benefited from and hugely appreciated our idyllic surroundings. I was quite dismayed this morning driving in to find the rain pouring down, because I have no memory. I have no memory of that ever happening here. But my recollection of Bedford as a place is of sunshine, sitting out on the lawns, going down to the lake. It was just a wondrous place. But there were some noticeable changes in the college infrastructure, in its appearance and facilities. There'd already been some expansion of the buildings in the early 1960s. But when I first came, the college had a quiet, almost sedate, I'm tempted to say genteel air. The Union Common Room was clean and tidy with comfortable armchairs, and much of the college kept pretty much to office hours. Even in my second year, my now husband has a distinct recollection of visiting me there and being totally taken aback by one of the library staff coming round, ringing a handbell at 5 o'clock to mark closing time. And if we wanted to have anything approaching a social life or entertainment of any kind in the evenings or weekends, we really had to go elsewhere. I remember going over to the University Union buildings in Mallet Street, where I joined the European Society, where I met other people and we established the University Folk Society. And of course, London generally had a lot to offer. So, I mean, I didn't feel I was lacking a social life, especially as we were then compared to students now, relatively affluent. We had very good basic grants. We had lots of extras. I seem to remember, I certainly do remember having holiday grants, having book grants. They were certainly Ilia were throwing money at us. Anyway, in the later 60s and 70s, though, Bedford, as I remember it, did become much more of a social centre itself, became somewhere that both students and staff spent more of their time, especially, I think, in the bar, rather than just coming in for lectures and tutorials, and presumably in the case of scientists, lab works. A pool table was introduced, not, I think, something that was there before the admission of men. And in various ways, the college as a whole became more of a social community, had much more of a buzz about it. The whole look and feel of the place, I think, changed quite a bit in those years too, though I think much of this came, arguably anyway, much of this came from the admission of more students rather than the admission of men as such, because there was such pressure on space. So that meant that the previous on-site accommodation in Reid had to be converted to offices. Some academic activities had to be moved off-site, and the elegant quadrangle, which happily has now been restored, was infilled with a far less elegant porter cabin. Overall, I don't think it's unfair to say that while it became a much livelier place, it also began to look more lived in, or dare I say, shabbier. More seriously, though, one fundamental thing that I've given some thought to since I was asked to speak is, did the male undergraduate invasion actively undermine any role it might previously have had, not just as a promoter of women's education, but as an active cheerleader for feminism? It's certainly possible that the fact that Bedford was an all-women college was for some of the earlier applicants, some of the pre-1965 applicants, one of its appeals. I don't have any real recollection of that being my desire to come here. It was, I wanted to study sociology. I wanted to be in London. The park was a bonus. What I also remember is that I came to college as an already active supporter of women's lib, and I don't have any memory of finding a hugely feminist ethos here, of opportunities to pursue those kind of activities. The only significant in-house recollection I have actually is of attending a Fawcett lecture at the college, I think delivered in this room, in this very room, by the redoubtable Germaine Greer. Otherwise, the only women's lib type memories I have are based out with the college at that time. But then we have to ask, might it not have been the case, might not have been the case anyway, that in the latter part of the 60s, women's lib generally was already being swamped by wider egalitarian movements, and specifically the student radicalism that Felix already mentioned. Again, I find it hard to point to a clear causal link between this time, this period of student activism, and the admission of male undergraduates at Bedford and an increase in student activism here. Bedford Students' Union did, I think, become more of a focal point, where some at least of the first wave male undergraduates made their presence felt. Looking back at written sources, I did find that as early as 1967, a male student was elected president of the Students' Union, closely followed by two others in the next 4 years. And Bedford students were certainly becoming more vocal in demanding the right to be heard, to be represented on college and departmental boards. I recollect too, as a very junior member of staff, our being locked in the senior common room for a while by, which I think was just a bit further over there, by students making demands of some kind. I cannot remember precisely what that was. I think the majority of us were just quite happy to have a few hours off to sit there carrying on drinking our coffee, and I think sherry was available. There were some of the older members of staff who were, perhaps who were really irate, who saw it as the end of civilization, but it honestly wasn't. The 60s and 70s, as Felix said, were a time when students everywhere were demanding the right to be heard, and not just in student politics, but on national and international issues. And in all honesty, what happened here at Bedford, whether linked or not to the admission of men, was pretty small change. It was never in quite the same league as student activism at other colleges like LSE and Hornsey. And it was a world apart from the mass political protests and rioting that ran through European cities from Paris to Prague and swept across campuses in America. Bedford College and its parkland environment still, I think, felt a relatively peaceful haven. So just to wind up, I said when I started that for various reasons, my own recollections and my interpretation of these might not be entirely representative. For other members of the college during the 60s and 70s, the admission of male undergraduates may well have felt and looked quite different. So perhaps ask yourselves, from your point of view, how much of a turning point, how seismic an event was it? Did it feel? What impact, direct or indirect, do you think it made on the college? Or conversely, what might things have been like during the remaining years in Regent's Park if male undergraduates hadn't been admitted? Would it have become a buzzier, more social, more active place anyway? Would there still have been an increase in student activism? And if there had, might it have had a different focus? Might it have kept a more feminist focus? Were there other changes that might have passed me by entirely? Was there an increase in sporting activities and sporting success? And a final thought, and I see a number of men here, some of whom may be partners of alumni, but some of whom I trust are alumni themselves. What effect did the admission of male undergraduates have on those very undergraduates themselves? What was your experience? Thank you.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. What was our experience? I mean, as a teacher, we won't go into this now, but it was quite different teaching male undergraduates from female ones. And what the difference, we can go into another time, but their reaction to criticism, for example, of their essays was rather different. So we now, as it were, move into more recent times. I'm going to ask the Principal and Vice Chancellor of Bedford, Royal Holloway and Bedford New College, to come and say something to us about the college as it is today.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, everybody. What wonderful talks. Thank you so much. It's been really brilliant for me throughout this 175th anniversary year so far to be learning so much more about Bedford College, about the history, and not least the individual stories and achievements and experiences. Although it's always had a quiet presence in my career, I started my first lecturing job was at Keele University. And the new Vice Chancellor at that time was one Professor, now Dame Janet Finch, herself a Bedford alum. And so it was always there as having inspired this incredible group. One of the first things she did as a Vice-Chancellor was to summon together a number of us to form a gender research group, which she led. And I think there are some fine role models. And I had a chance just a few weeks ago. She's very sorry not to be here, but she now lives up in the Northwest, and the travel is difficult, though she's still very active supporting University of London research through the Research England School of Advanced Studies Advisory Group. But I had a chance to see her and to thank her for that legacy. So there we go. It is a very small world. But thank you to everybody who's spoken today. And I know Heathcliff and Peggy are also going to share an update on some of the research they've been doing. It is really special to be sharing this moment with you all. Thank you to Regent's University for the music, as Abbas say, but also for enabling the day as well. This site that I know is so very special to you all, and it's good to be here. But the life of Bedford College far transcends a physical location, of course, and it's very much still in our hearts and our minds and our practices as a university, as we are today. My role, and I often speak of it to people as a privilege and a huge responsibility. Those of us who are given the great honour of leading a university are mere stewards of somewhere for a short time. And I hope many of you present know just how meaningful the foundational, these first principles of both Royal Holloway and Bedford colleges are to me and many others as we try and steer the university into the future. You've already heard Felix refer to the University of Social Purpose, and I hope that pays due respect to that long legacy of both colleges. So the legacy of Bedford is certainly present every day in my job, not just the stories and the lives and the paintings on the walls, but through the brilliant research and education that is ongoing by all of our teams, and not least through our amazing students and our student leaders. And we've heard about that kind of beginning of student leadership. A number of former SU sabbatical leads, stepped into parliamentary roles just this week. It's a powerful thing, student leadership, where it leads to, and we nurture it with care and attention, I think. I had the great joy at our recent summer ball to gather together with the last 4 years of Royal Holloway and Bedford New College Student Union presidents, each of them a fine example of female leadership. So that means a lot to see. It's a deep and it's an abiding legacy and a tradition, I think, of female leadership in action. The gift of all of you in the room is to honour that memory, but also to help us to shape that future and to be with us on that journey. I'm not going to give a long story about Royal Holloway, but I do want to mention just a few of the things and a few individuals, because I had the pleasure just a few weeks ago at our volunteering awards to present what was the Mayor's Cup to a student called Sana Raymond. Sama is the first in her family to go to university. She's a commuting student. She was one of Universities UK's 100 Faces of a First in Families campaign this year. So this story of widening access, of social mobility, of possibility, of choice and opportunity is present all around me. And sometimes I get the opportunity to pay tribute to that. She's a superb psychology student as well, presented at her first British Psychological Society conference recently. But I think very moving for me was to step outside of the awards hall and to have her mum come running over to me and whip me up in her arms and to say, "You are my sister." And we are all sisters and brothers in this enterprise. Emma McClement, our student coordinator for the Campus Football League, just nominated recently for an Outstanding Contribution Award. I could list hundreds of examples just from this year alone of students who are honouring this set of stories and taking those possibilities forward. And in our artistic, our cultural, our creative, our social scientific and our scientific endeavours, the work carries on. Our new strategy is called RH 2030s, and I hope it will very visibly embody the founding principles of Elizabeth Jesser Reid. Social purpose has driven this amazing educational community from the outset. We have our new university values co-created with students and colleagues over many months, and they are to be open and respectful and innovative and daring. And I hope they are values that Bedford alum can really hold in their hearts and continue to live and take forward. Our strategic ambitions cover inclusive education and research, and I'm looking towards Ruth Livesey, who's been leading on that strand, being civic and globally engaged, exactly what Felix was talking about, valuing partnerships and collaboration, and enabling skills for choice and opportunity for our students and for our colleagues. We recently had the gift of a group of students from Feltham, from the Reach Academy, to come and do, we paid them to be mentors on our strategy, to be a kind of red team and to test its validity for them. One of the things they also got to do was to have a tour of the campus with one of our present students. And one student came running up to me afterwards. Her name is Keisha, and she's given me permission to use her name. And I've met Keisha on a number of occasions now. She said, "Do you know that that building, the library, is named after a woman called Emily Wilding Davison? And do you know what she did? I'm going to study here because of that." And seeing Keisha just fired up, that's what education does. So I go back to those words. It's a privilege and it's a responsibility. So as we move forward, we welcome this opportunity to reflect with you all on the astonishing history that brings us to this moment, the 175th year of Bedford College. And for personally me to thank you for all of you who play a very active contribution in our university life, from supporting the work of the archive. And I know there's a chance to continue to do that. There are leaflets on your seats, and I think Claire will happily share more about the plans around a project archivist in due course, but also everything you do as mentors, as friends, as ambassadors, as advisors, and as advocates. And so many of you have made me personally so very welcome as Vice-Chancellor and Principal, and I thank you for that. I do hope we will be able to welcome you later in the year to continue these celebrations to the Egham campus in Surrey as part of the Heritage Open Day celebrations on the 14th of September, and I know details of that will be available after today. But mostly, I just want to pay tribute to that remarkable 175 years and to all of you, and to thank you for being part of the story of social purpose and inclusive education and research today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that inspiring, I felt quite moved by it actually, very inspiring thought about how we take the Bedford ideal forward into the next century. So we're going to hear a little bit now from two of our actual researchers, people who work on and in the archives. I don't know if you want to come up here and talk, and will you explain what you both are doing? Okay, I should tell you their names. The male is Heathcliff Newman, and Peggy Ainsworth, who is the art collections officer.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I am really pleased to be here today with my colleague Heathcliff to present the research project Adventurers All, Bedford Travel Stories, which was researched and written by my colleague Heathcliff, our archives assistant, and also Gareth Hughes, our curatorial assistant, who unfortunately can't be with us today. Their research contributes to the ongoing work that we do to preserve and tell the stories of Bedford College through our fantastic art collections and archives. Recent highlights in the collection have seen works from the Herringham collection go on display as far afield as Forlì in Italy in a great big pre-Raphaelite exhibition, and also Geoffrey and Christopher Herringham by Annie Swinnerton. You may know that painting as The Jolly Gardeners. That was recently on loan to Tate Britain. They had it in their Swinnerton display in 2023. We've also still welcomed new donations to the archive, and our most recent donation was a notebook of an economics student from Bedford. So that's had some really nice insights into day-to-day life at the college. This afternoon, we're going to be next to our research display boards, which you may have seen when you came first into the Herringham building this morning. So do come and have a chat with us to find out more. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Heathcliff to present the project Adventure Us All, Bedford Travel Stories.
Hello. So Gareth and I were both given our own separate briefs. Gareth's was to look into the founding motives of the college, and mine was to look more into the international direction of the college in the 20th century. And we eventually merged those two together. And because Gareth and I are both looking to specialize in French literature, we took kind of a post-structuralist kind of view of everything. And we started thinking about Bedford College more as an idea, very kind of Platonic kind of idea, rather than simply a site. So with that, we've created 4 kind of sub-headings. The first is looking into a pilgrimage of ideas, the many ideas that came into Bedford from those founding principles. We especially focus on Sarah Parker Remond and her staying with Mrs. Reid in her home while she was studying. And we also have linked this to the social movements that Royal Holloway and Bedford New College students continue to be involved in today, especially to do with climate justice, trans rights, and disability studies. Then we move on to an idea that we called Beyond 4 Walls, which focused on Bedford College as a traveling idea, not just in the many sites that it has been housed inside, but we also have focused on a specific article written in one of the Bedford student magazines that was entitled Exile, which was written by a student who was in her 3rd year of study at Bedford College when she and all her friends were evacuated to Newnham College during the war. We're especially interested in this essay for one line in which she says that she will never enter Bedford College as a student again. And Gareth and I have found many, many relations and links towards the feelings of many students who had a similar experience during the COVID lockdowns and who also came to that realization that they were finishing their university education in a different setting. Then we move on to focus on the Reid Trust and more specifically the Not Cut Travelling Studentship. This was from a donation from a lifelong student and then eventually Reid trustee, Miss Rachel Lydia Notcutt, to provide a student of Bedford College the opportunity to travel for a year. As part of the conditions for this studentship, the women were to write a journal of their experiences. And we have many of those journals from about 1919, which was the first award given to Noel Hake, who went to Italy. And we end with Doris Baines, who became the librarian of Bedford College well into her later years, retiring, I think, not until she was about 67 years old. On my part, I've been doing a lot of the transcriptions of these journals because a lot of them are handwritten and they will be made available as an online exhibit, so you can read the whole thing. But we've got some great quotes on our boards for that. And then the final section is looking into Bedford's intrepid artists, which is what Gareth has been focusing on predominantly, not just Christiana Herringham and her travel journals and her travel journals, that's good enough, but also the work of Miss Penrose as well, the first principal of Bedford and Royal Holloway, and her watercolours that she made when she went to Italy with her father when he became the first director of the British School in Rome, and then later her trips to Greece as well. But that's what we've tried to do. We've really tried to make sure that people know that Bedford is not just a place, it's not just the events, but it's also the idea of Bedford that we carry with us every day in our work, in our research, and in our social purposes now at Basborough Holloway and Bedford New College. So yeah, come have a chat with us. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I do go and have a look at the boards which are by the Herringham entrance where we came in, which are really fascinating. I have to say I didn't know about the Notcut Travelling Scholarship. I thought that those diaries will be really fascinating to read. And I remember Miss Baines. Many of you must remember Miss Baines, who ran the library. She was quite a person. So what we're going to do now is that Claire Daunton, who chairs the Bedford Society Committee, and she does almost all the work, and the rest of us just say, well done, Claire, thanks very much. So Claire's going to have a few words to say, and then we will all migrate for tea. Claire.
Well, it's almost time for tea, but I am going to keep you for a few moments, as Caroline said. First of all, for some thank yous. Thank you very much to Caroline for chairing the panel and to our speakers. I think we've had a really good afternoon of talk, so thank you very much indeed. Special thanks to Ruth Livesey, who is sitting in the front row here, Professor Ruth Livesey, who in the background has done a huge amount of work in bringing this panel together and making this event happen. So thank you, Ruth. And it's not the first time that Ruth has been involved with the Bedford Society Committee, so I hope that will continue. And it's a really good link with the college today, which is very important to us. And thank you to Julie also for speaking. And as a principal, I think Principal and Vice Chancellor and as her successor before her has made the society feel very welcome and very much part of the college today. And I should also thank, in spite of the music background, I should also thank Regent's College, Regent's University, for welcoming us back here and for providing us with the space at the time, the opportunity to gather again in what still feels like our home. One also housekeeping notice, and that is that those of you who are going to visit St John's Lodge Gardens, and again, a note of thanks to Nick Biddle, the park manager at Regent's Park and Primrose Hill. Those of you who are going on those two visits at 4 o'clock and 4:30, the 4 o'clock group, please gather at 3:50 at the main entrance to college. The 4:30 group, please gather at 4:20 so that we can set off in good time. So in our talks this afternoon, we've been hearing about the college in the context of our 175-year history. We heard at the event in April in Bedford Square about the early years of Bedford, and this afternoon's talks have elaborated on and continued that story to the present. On both occasions, speakers have drawn on the riches of the Bedford archives, both photographs and written material. But all of us here, all of us are part of that archive with our personal stories, first as students and now as alumni, with our academic record, our departmental affiliations, our membership of societies and clubs and sports teams, and of course of our enduring friendships. And all this alongside the official records of the college's history. It's a wonderfully rich archive, as we've seen today, and I know from firsthand, and one we should be proud of, one that deserves to be preserved and used and showcased to the full. This year, as part of the anniversary celebrations, the focus of our fundraising efforts is the creation of a project archivist role, which will ensure that the archives, our lasting legacy, can be properly and fully catalogued, made available, and celebrated for its richness and value. I recognise that we all have different calls on our resources, and of course, any amount donated is hugely valued and hugely appreciated. But to establish the Bedford Archivist role and make an appointment, I, along with others in this special anniversary year, have donated £1,750 each. If 24 more could join us in donating this amount, we will have sufficient funding for the first year. To maintain the role and its valuable work into the future, we are all invited to consider including a donation in our wills. If you feel able to support the college and the heritage of Bedford in either of these ways, please do get in touch with the Alumni and Development Office, and you'll find material on your seats. You'll find a piece of paper to read, to take away with you. And please, if you feel that you can help, do get in touch with college, with the Alumni Office. And I know that they would be very pleased to hear from you. And now it's time for tea. And thank you.